episode is sponsored by Free Market Kids. Join the league of families who are transforming family time into unforgettable Bitcoin learning experiences. With our HODL Up Bitcoin mining board game, you're not just playing. You're building bridges, creating memories, and unlocking the brilliance of the future one block at a time.
They developed something called the age 18 list. So basically, what do we want our kids to have developed, whether it's character or skills or other things like that? Basically, who do we want them to be by age 18?
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Bitcoin Homeschoolers. Today, Tali and I sit down with the very thoughtful Josh Friedeman, and he talks about his experience going all the way through high school being homeschooled. Enjoy. We have Josh Friedeman from Business Bitcoinization, and today we're going to hear a very different side of things. He happens to have been homeschooled, and this podcast is about Bitcoiners who are also homeschoolers, and this is going to be a really interesting discussion. We can't wait to get into it. Josh, thank you for joining us today. This is great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the time to talk about this. Homeschooling is something that is really important to me, and even though I'm not homeschooling anyone at the moment, I'm excited to be able to share some of my experiences from being homeschooled, and hopefully some people will gain encouragement from that and maybe pick up some ideas in the process of either what to do or what not to do.
Yeah.
Depending on what you think about me.
No, that's great. No, we appreciate it. So maybe can you start there? What was your experience like being homeschooled?
Before we jump into that, can we ask you, did your mom ever tell you why she decided to homeschool you guys?
So I've probably heard her talk about that in the past, and it was definitely something that both my parents wanted to do. I know different couples have, one person or the other wants to do it and has to convince the other, but they really had a unified front there, which I think is really valuable to make sure before you make a big decision like this, you're on the same page. But I can't remember her exact explanation or their exact explanation, but I think that they just really believed that they could do a good job, and they both grew up in a public school system that they had different experiences, but they both would probably say that those experiences were lacking. I know for my mom, one thing I can say is that she was the valedictorian of her class, and she would, going up through school, she would finish her work ahead of a lot of her classmates and find herself sitting in class doing nothing. And as a homeschooler, you don't have to do that. And we can talk about a little bit more of that later. But my dad, he's been through the public education system. He graduated high school, went to college, got his bachelor's in education. He was a student athlete during that time. During his, he redshirted, and so he got a master's in education during that time. Went off, got a Master of Divinity, which is a seminary degree, went back to the University of Kansas where he'd gotten his previous 2 degrees, got a PhD in education. So if anyone should have insight into the education system, especially the public education system, it's my dad. And frankly, he's not a fan of it, despite having spent that much time there. He's still an educator to this day, but I don't think he would say that public education is the way to go for at least a lot of people.
Yeah. Wow, what a background. Go ahead, Tali.
So when you were being homeschooled, because I don't know how old you are, is it in the late 1980s, 1990s? Around what time are we talking about?
So I'm in my early 30s, about to turn 32 next month, depending on when this airs. But
happy birthday.
I was homeschooled. Yeah, so I was born in 91. I was homeschooled throughout the 90s, which is like kind of when it was still a little weird, but not quite as weird as the 80s. And then there were 6 of us growing up, and there's still 6 of us. So nothing tragic happened there, in case the way I phrased that sounded strange. But my youngest brother graduated high school, I believe in 2016, if that's right. No, it's not 2016. He just graduated college. So it must have been 2019 or 2018, something like that. So he's totally out. But our education kind of spans probably the mid 90s to the mid 2010s, and so there's quite a bit of homeschooling. There's quite a bit about homeschooling that changed across those 20 years.
Right. Yeah. Because when you were in homeschooling, I think the majority of Americans probably didn't even know that that was a possibility. I didn't. And my kids are younger than you. And so to go back even 10 years from when we started, it must have been a very, very strong conviction on the part of both of your parents to pursue that. And especially because that was pre everybody had a computer time. And so whatever curriculum you wanted to use, you had to get the physical books. And, where do you go to source those materials? Where do you go for support? They must have had really strong conviction. So
just to keep moving, what was your point of view while you were being homeschooled? Because the next question I'm going to get into later is going to be like, as a Bitcoiner looking back, like kind of making connections with a lot of things that we see today. But for you personally, I mean, you've obviously graduated, you've gone on, you're building your own career, so it's behind you. What did you feel while you were going through it?
Yeah. I mean, I always really liked it. There are a couple things that there's one thing that was a frustration for me at times. For me, it wasn't enough to actually want to not be homeschooled on most days. Then there's kind of a secondary one, which, you can kind of weigh in for yourself. Neither of these are legitimate issues for most homeschoolers today. So the first thing is I didn't have the opportunity to play sports. I mean, I did, but it was a lot harder. And so having that experience is a little bit of a frustration at certain times, especially as I had friends who were in private schools, or I didn't really have that many close friends in public schools, but friends would be on teams, football teams and whatnot. They were able to play team sports, and I kind of missed out on a good chunk of that. Now I'd play some rec soccer. We kind of had this thing in my family. I guess this is especially important with 6 kids, but we're only going to do kind of one thing at a time. Commit to that thing, go all in on it, do it well. And so for us, it was Boy Scouts was a pretty significant thing, and we can maybe talk about that. I would not personally put my kids in Boy Scouts in the future. I think if they even exist, I don't know. They've definitely gone downhill significantly in recent years. But for the boys in our family, Boy Scouts was a pretty big thing. After Boy Scouts, I decided to pick up sports again, soccer. It was just hard because I'm a Christian, and they practiced on Wednesdays, which is when we had church, and they had games on Sundays, which is when I was in church. So it's just one of those things I had to figure out what's really important to me in life. And so that was one slight frustration. Now, it's not a frustration anymore for a lot of people because there are these homeschool groups that have sports teams. So my youngest brothers, they were heavily involved in basketball, had a great experience. And the youngest was even my youngest brother was thinking about maybe playing in college. And so he really developed that talent, had the team experience. They traveled places so that's not too much of an excuse anymore for people. The second thing was just you don't necessarily have as many friends potentially if you're when I was coming up. Now I had some great friends that I'm friends with to this day, and honestly, give me a handful of friends that I'm friends with for decades over a few that I know in high school, or over a lot that I know in high school and then don't see again. That's how I feel personally. But once again, if you're on a team, if you're involved in these homeschool groups these days, you're going to have a lot of people. And honestly, they're super cool people. Not nearly as strange as some 80s and 90s homeschoolers were. Now, you're still going to find strange homeschoolers, and that's what everyone's concerned about, the socialization and all those things. But the truth is there's some really weird people out there in public and private schools too. So you're going to find great people in these homeschool groups these days.
Yeah, I think the whole socialization thing is kind of the FUD equivalent. That's the big FUD for homeschooling.
Absolutely.
That's always the first thing that people ask. I know I personally asked that when Tali first suggested homeschooling. So, no, that's great. Tali, is there anything else on on that background?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the discussion about sports groups, because that's another common question we receive a lot from people who are thinking about homeschooling. And for our family in particular, I mean, we're about to leave for the National Homeschooler Soccer Tournament. And this is we've been involved on the same team through two boys for 9 straight years, and we've seen lots of people come and go, but it's always been very consistent. It's a very tight-knit group, and we are very competitive. The kids do very well, and they definitely get to experience both the homeschooling side of the academic studies and the athletic side. So like you said, It's not really something that's absent anymore. It is out there, and sometimes you might have to, depending on where you live, ask a few more people to get to the right organization, but they're there.
And I would say too, when our boys were very small, we had the Cub Scouts. We didn't stay with the Scouts. I think you're right. I haven't looked at it recently, but I think you're right with the trend with that organization, and that leaves a gap where whether you homeschool or not, what kind of outdoor activities, what kind of leadership activities can you give to especially for the boys? That's what I'm thinking.
Well, there's Trail Life. Trail Life came up, and it's pretty popular right now in the homeschooling world.
Right. Okay. So that maybe we can list that as a resource in the end on that, because that to me it's something that when I was growing up, if someone was an Eagle Scout, that was a major deal, and that's you had done a lot to put in your proof of work to become an Eagle Scout. And I don't know if where the program is, where the value is in that, but if there's another organization like what you're describing that picks it up, so I think those are all interesting takeaways from that.
Yeah, there's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just to interject there. First of all, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. You have flexibility to build all sorts of skills into your kids' lives, to take trips on your own, or with a group of other men if you're taking your sons, or however you want to divide and conquer. But there's a lot of opportunity for doing stuff like that. Now, that means that you kind of have to keep yourself in top shape and to hone your own skills, which there's always a temptation as you get older, I feel like, to let some of those things fall by the wayside. But I feel like homeschooling challenges you to keep yourself sharp in a lot of different ways. Now, my sister was also involved in American Heritage Girls. I don't know. I know they still exist. I don't know how they're doing, but I think my sister was one of the first, because we started a troop, or whatever you might call them, very early on in the organization's history. And I think she was one of the very first to get the Stars and Stripes Award, which is kind of like the highest, I guess you'd say, an Eagle Scout equivalent. Certainly the first in our area, but she's a very early person to get the Stars and Stripes Award. All 5 of the boys were Eagle Scouts, but sometimes you just got to go. There's a season for certain organizations. Sometimes you got to create something new. Like, I would say towards the end, Boy Scouts seemed like they were getting a little soft. I don't know about Trail Life, but I imagine that there's just that temptation to make things easier for people, and you kind of become a soft organization over time. Maybe you come in and you don't have an organization, but you just create a group around you and go teach great life skills in the outdoors and keep yourself sharp in the process.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of the best things about homeschooling is how active parents can be. And if you have a skill that you want to share with people, I mean, you benefit so many families, and vice versa, right? So, teamwork.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, first of all, who cares more about the child than the parent, right? Just to put in the effort to find the group or start your own, whatever it is, and then it's like a free market. If you're really good at one trade and I'm good at another, it's almost like the start of a free market. It's the same thing with almost like co-op groups or other types of things. Did you have anything like that, Josh? Did you have any kind of co-op groups that your parents used to help with different subjects that they felt strong or weaker in?
So we did have times where we'd get together with other families, and I think there was probably a co-op we were a part of. I just remember getting together with groups of homeschoolers for like larger events, do things here and there, but it was never nearly as structured as what it is today. And I say structured in a good sense, like there's a lot of opportunities now, but I'm trying to think if there was probably a subject or two that we may have gone to someone else for like for a very short period of time. Maybe it was like getting ready for standardized testing, getting some additional math tutoring or something like that. But for the most part, it was all stuff we kind of did in-house. Now, everyone doesn't have to do that, but that it worked for our family. And even, one of the things we added in that's a little abnormal is this isn't quite as abnormal, but we did Latin. And then my dad works at a seminary. And so I think starting in maybe ninth grade, we would start taking Greek in seminary class. And then after a couple of years of that, a lot of us went on to take Hebrew for about a year and a half as well. And so we were in there with seminary students. We didn't really have that much classroom experience, but that was before that. But that was something that probably set us up well for college, just being there, sitting in class. I mean, some lectures, some actual translation and stuff like that in class. But you get additional opportunities that you don't necessarily get when you're in a private or public school setting.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And that's something I don't think we can highlight enough, just how many resources and how much room there is for creativity that are out there. And it's only increased. As you commented that you were relatively early in the growth of the homeschooling movement, especially with COVID, it really exploded. And with technologies, things like Sailor Academy and Khan Academy, and I've lost track of, honestly, there's so many resources available. Plus you have organizational resources too. And you throw that on top of a parent's ability to be creative and say, you're going to go sit in on this class with a bunch of college students or whatever. Is you as a kid, you're like, okay, whatever, mom, dad, I'll go wherever you say, right? It's pretty amazing that what you can paint in terms of an experience for your kids. So, all right. I was thinking we could transition a little bit more to if you would imagine, Josh, that there's someone listening to this that either has young kids or they're thinking about young kids and they're Bitcoiners. As a Bitcoiner yourself, and you look back on your experience, I have some assumptions about how you feel about homeschooling, but maybe if you could give a little context now with hindsight, in particular hindsight as a Bitcoiner, about your homeschooling experience.
Well, Bitcoin is where I focus a lot of my time and effort, and I want to increasingly do that professionally, focus my time and effort toward Bitcoin. But at the same time, I feel like this answer I'd give the same answer if I were a Bitcoiner or not. So just kind of set that there. I really love what y'all are doing with the whole comparing Bitcoin to homeschooling. I think there's a lot there. And so I think they're very complementary, but if for some reason I were on another podcast and I weren't a Bitcoiner, I still give some of the same types of answers. That said, I do think that homeschooling, if it's done well in a way that sparks curiosity in people, that you'll go into life curious. You'll go into life continuing to find new things to learn. You'll probably be more likely to consider things off the beaten path. I feel like just by being homeschooled, especially earlier on, probably still so, you're doing something that's a little abnormal. There've been a lot of things in my life, I feel like, even though I would consider myself a normal functioning human being, there are a lot of things that a lot of opportunities I had, experiences I had growing up that were different and unique and beneficial. But the one thing I would say is probably, other than just, I would say, don't neglect key basic subjects like, the math, and make sure that people's language skills are strong. I would say one of the strongest things to focus in on, and especially early on, would be engendering or growing in your kids a love for reading, because that helps to spark that curiosity. That helps to discover new worlds, things that have happened in the past, or reading things, reading fiction and thinking about what could be. I think that the reading is a great gateway into all sorts of learning later in life. That's one thing that my parents did a lot. I mean, we remember. This is kind of something we talk about in our family, but kind of like one of those core memories is after lunch. Three or four of us at the time were standing around chanting the name of a book that we wanted my mom to read. And so she'd read through us all the time. She'd read to us all the time. And then my dad in the evenings, maybe after dinner or, like at the table, or we'd go sit in the living room. He'd read Chronicles of Narnia. He'd read Lord of the Rings, different things like that. And they just kind of like books were part of our life, and they continue to be in a very significant way. So that's like one of the most important things. Read to your kids all the time. Encourage them with great books that they'd enjoy reading, and that's going to be a recipe for success.
Yeah, I love that. You're nodding your head. Tell anything else on?
Well, I can see that you still love books because your background is just covered with hundreds of books.
This is only a few of them. Right now, my wife and I are living in an apartment, and we only have so much space, but we have two other rooms with plenty of books, and then I have a closet just off to the side that has boxes of books as well. But yeah, still love reading. I've kind of turned to audiobooks significantly as well. But in my parents' house, still to this day in the living room, there's one wall that's an entire bookshelf. And then there's another place that used to be our classroom that's now more of like a sitting area, study area. And there's, two walls that are just full of bookshelves. And so we have books all over the place, and they're very comforting to me. I love having books around, but it's just great to have access to good reading.
Oh, yeah. So when our kids were little, I used to stand in line outside the library on the day of the month when they would have the library sale. And back then, it was 10 cents a book. So you would stand in long lines, people, like before the door even opened. And when the door opened, everybody just like ran in and started just like putting just armfuls of books into their basket. And I remember bringing home bag after bag after bag of books. And because they're only 10 cents, the kids can do whatever they want. They can take it to the bathroom with them. They can bring it to bed with them. And I'm not upset when they bend the corner or if the book gets destroyed because it's been like carried everywhere with them. I would rather they fall in love with the books than to worry about keeping the book nice. I knew some people who were so careful about their books because, I don't know, they were trying to keep it nice. And then in so doing, they were discouraging their kids from really interacting with the book. So if my kids wanted to take crayons and markers and they went into the book and they were adding their own illustrations to the story, like that's all good, So whatever it takes to just, like you said, surround your kids with reading material, they find a way to interact with the books if we don't put a bunch of rules on how books should be treated.
Well, the other thing that Josh said that I really like too, and Josh, I'm really glad you brought this up. I personally have not been highlighting reading much lately. I've been talking a lot about homeschooling lately, but I have not been. I just almost in the back of my mind take it for granted that, of course, everybody has thousands of books in their house, and that's just the way it is. But the other thing that was on my mind with your comment there is the involvement of, you said basically, I think you were saying your dad was reading, Tolkien or whatever it was. And I think part of what you're doing with your kids is you're setting the example. So I could flood you with a bunch of books, but if I just go and watch my TV, sitcom or stay on the internet or do something else, then the message that the kids are going to pick up on is from an example standpoint. So what I hear you saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that your parents were right there with you. Like they were reading, either reading to you or you saw them reading or you're reading together. Like to me, that's a second big takeaway. You're setting the example for your kids at all times. And if you really want to cultivate a love of reading, well then, yeah, go get books and let them see you read.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that extends to many other areas of their lives. So my parents, we've always been involved in ministry. My dad, in addition to being a seminary professor, he's also a pastor. There are a lot of pastors' kids that traditionally walk away from the Christian faith because they've been hurt by people in a church. They've seen how their their parents have been treated, or they've seen that their parents kind of live two different lives. And I was so fortunate to have parents that, they say something and that's who they are, that's what they believe. And so I've seen that modeled in many different areas. Education's one of them for sure. It's a very important one, but just in general, seeing your parents say something and then follow through and be that person they say they are is really powerful. So live it in front of your kids, and your example is just going to be so influential in their lives.
But I love hearing personal stories. And so the idea of people like they had a habit of reading, or they built a treehouse together or something. So would you be okay sharing maybe what one of your favorite memories or things that you recall from your homeschooling experience that really stuck with you?
Yeah, as I think about it, there would be tons and tons of stories that I could share. One of the things that I don't know if this would have come up naturally in other scenarios is just that my mom was amazing at helping things seem just amazing and really come to life. Like, this is true educationally, and we'll get to that, but like birthday parties for her were just this massive thing. And we didn't have tons of money. It's like, I don't know if people are aware, but seminary professors generally don't get paid all that much. It's just not, we didn't have a lot of money, and it's not that like we didn't have enough money. We were always fine, but it's not like when my mom's throwing these big birthday parties, it's because we have all this money we can throw at expensive things. But what she could make with a refrigerator box would blow your mind. And so like we'd have these, we'd have like an underground railroad birthday party, Civil War themed. We have World War II themed birthday parties or whatever else. When we were kids, a lot of it was like fighting types of parties. But like she'd put on these whole events. I remember when we were studying the Vikings, she created an entire Viking ship with refrigerator boxes, and like being able to go inside of a Viking ship as a little soldier, making helmets with out of milk jugs. You turn them upside down. You had a little nose guard and all those things, like mining for gold with little like gold pellet BBs in sand, and all these different things like that kind of really help things come to life. And so that's what I first thought of when you asked about that. But especially if I were like sitting down with my siblings and we were talking about different things, all sorts of stories would come out of this. But definitely a lot of really fun memories.
Yeah, that sounds really special. I now that I think about it too, I mean, we've talked about this with others, but this I think hammers it home. Like the amount of time you spend with your kids is so much greater when they're young than after they leave. But it's also true between siblings. If you were to go to a public school and you were in separate classes and you're quote unquote socializing, even though half the time you're standing in line or you're sitting in a seat and you can't move, the memories that you have with your siblings, not just your mom making these amazing, very creative type of things. It sounds like a pretty fun house. But you also have these things that you can share, these lifelong memories. You now have these bonds with your siblings as well. And I think back on our kids are pretty close in age, 4 kids within 5 years, a tight shop group, and the number of stories and things they did together. What you're describing is making me recall a lot of what I witnessed. And I didn't even get to see it every day because I was working. So, that's another benefit to the homeschooling side from family bonds that you just, that's at a certain point in their life that it's only it only lasts for so long, and then you can't go back. So, well, thanks for sharing that.
So one additional thing that is probably worth adding, it's not particularly homeschool related, but that as you talked about, just kind of like spending time with your siblings or with your family, one of the things that we really valued and that my parents really set a precedent for was using family meal times as really valuable real estate. So for us, that's kind of where we did family devotions. Before dinner, we'd have quite a bit of things we'd do together. We sang together, all these different things. And taking advantage of that time, eating together is really important. And you know, this may not be relevant to most people, but my dad has been teaching this type of stuff in his classes at the seminary for years. And would you mind if he wrote a book?
No, come on,
would you
just
mind
go
if
ahead.
I kind of share the title and
Yeah,
let
you can
people
go ahead.
So this is, for Christian families specifically, but honestly, if you have no faith, you could still find some value in something like this. It's called Discipleship in the Home, and his name is Matt Friedeman, and it talks about basically how he raised kids and how he would recommend what he's learned from other people. He also recently has done something for grandparents, kind of added it to the new edition of the book. One of the interesting things that he took away from that, and this goes back to homeschooling some, is pretty soon after having their first kid, my oldest brother, they kind of started looking at each other saying, like, what are we doing? Like, what, we could mess this up. And I think part of your message is, like, as long as you're there, as long as you're really looking for the best for them, you're not going to be perfect, but you're not really going to mess things up. But one thing that they talked about, or one thing they talked about together and then decided to do, and they also encouraged this in the book, is they developed something called the age 18 list. So basically, what do we want our kids to have developed, whether it's character or skills or other things like that? Basically, who do we want them to be by age 18? And obviously, you want to talk about this in broader terms. It can be somewhat specific, like you don't want to plan out your kids' lives. But knowing as parents, what do we want for our kids? And what do we need to be doing to make that outcome the most likely? And so my dad, I heard him talking a few years ago, kind of raised the point, like, really, if you get into adolescence and these things, you're not well on your way to achieving these things, then it gets a lot more difficult. So he really said it's kind of like an age 12 or 13 list. And so I don't say that to put pressure on people, but especially if you're early on in your parenting career, so to speak, thinking through what you want your kids to be like, who you want them to be, and figuring out how you can help them to get there is incredibly valuable, just so you have that long-term perspective and plan.
Yeah, I love it. Low time preference, long-term planning applied to your kid's future, basically.
I think
Indeed.
I think you're right in
beautiful.
saying that instead of an age 18 list, it almost really needs to be an age 12 list, maybe even younger, if you really think about it. Yeah, because when we were young parents, I remember, when you talk to other parents, you always hear the thing about the terrible twos and, oh my God, just hold on, you're holding your newborn. They're like, oh, just wait until the baby's 2. And then he or she's just going to be shouting no at you all the time. So they create this expectation. And then, of course, the other part of that is once they enter teenage years, expect that they will rebel and they're going to be rude and they're going to tell you they hate you all the time. Like that's almost the cultural expectations that I kept hearing until I started looking into some of the people who are veteran homeschooling parents, and they're like, no, it doesn't have to be like that. If you have good communication with them, you don't have to live through the terrible twos. You'll have a little bit of struggle, but it's not going to be the terrible with a capital T twos or the rebellious teenage years because we didn't go through that. My kids would tell me that my memory is not perfect, that I only remember the good stuff. But in my mind, I don't feel like we went through the horrible stages that culture in general tells you to expect. And I think it comes down to communication and, the list that you were talking about, like the qualities that you want to help them develop from the very beginning, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Love
Yeah.
of reading would be on there probably. So, great
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
So to speak to that, we didn't really go through, I can't really speak to the terrible twos quite as much. I'm sure there were some of us in all stages, some of us were more difficult than others, I would say. And that's just from what I've heard, not as much from my direct memory. But we definitely didn't have any terrible adolescent periods. We had strong values that, we believed in things, and part of that's because, like, we saw our parents and they said something and they lived that thing. It's not that they said one thing and lived something different. And I think that's a really valuable thing, just kind of going back to that theme we talked about earlier. But, yeah, we had some arguments and difficult times, but it wasn't anything like a rebellious adolescent period that, like you said, Tally, is like, that's just almost the expectation. It doesn't have to be. There are a lot of things in life that we just kind of assume are going to happen. They don't have to happen. It's just that we're so used to kind of falling into patterns that we see around us. And homeschooling is certainly not one of those patterns, or traditionally hasn't been. And it's a valuable thing for people to consider strongly, for sure.
Yeah. So I always ask people what recommendations they have for resources or other ideas. You've already been kind of giving some kind of value bombs along the way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, discipleship in the home, definitely we'll have a link to that in the show notes. But is there anything that we didn't cover about homeschooling in general, or something specific that you think we should have covered? Anything that we missed?
Well, we were going to talk about the concept of dyslexia and
that's
how
a great one.
Common it
Yeah,
is, and it might be hard for parents to diagnose because they're in the teaching mode, and they're most likely, if the child isn't reading, they're going to think, oh, it's my fault, I didn't teach them the right way, or I'm doing something wrong. But you mentioned that it is actually quite a common occurrence, and that there are ways to help combat that.
Yeah. So a few things there. One of the things jogged my memory on something I meant to say earlier. And so I'll get to the dyslexia side in just a moment. Let me preface the dyslexia part by saying, I don't know what I'm talking about, but my wife is a dyslexia therapist. She went to school for this. This is what she has her master's in. And one of the interesting things that I learned from her is that 15 to 20% of the population have some sort of issue with dyslexia to some degree or another. Obviously, there's variation there. The thing I wanted to bring up before we kind of talk about dyslexia a little bit more is I really encourage people. You have the flexibility of doing this as a homeschooler. Keep it easy. Don't try to model the classroom setting that you see in schools, or that you probably grew up with. Like, I remember, and I can't remember what grade this is, but it was probably like mid-elementary school years. My brother, who's just beneath me, we're the closest in the family by age, about 16 months apart. We'd get up early in the morning. We'd go do our school, and it felt like within 30 minutes, but probably like within an hour, we'd be done with everything. We'd spend the rest of the day playing, outside, riding bikes, whatever. Like, that's an amazing opportunity, especially for younger kids. My wife recently read a book, and I forget what it was, but it's talking about the value of why it's so important for kids to be outside and how little they get outside these days. And it's just, it's tragic. That's kind of how our system's set up. But you don't have to set your household up like that. And so, we didn't take this change as we got older. But we didn't take a lot of time doing tests. And like, that's a lot of stress. Like, you should have a good idea if your kid's learning the material or not, because there are only a few, check their work every day. Like we did our math, and it was checked, and we have to go fix the problems and whatever else. But we didn't just like have tons and tons and tons of tests. Now, my wife's family did it a little bit differently. Had some friends who had like beasts of history tests. Like their mom she was a history person. And so anyway, people do it differently, but take advantage of the opportunity to, take a little more of an easy pace, or at least don't stress your kids out with like excess testing and excess structure. So there's that. But when it comes to the dyslexia therapy side of things, an interesting thing, in addition to the 15 to 20% of people have some level of dyslexia, is that in order to actually be diagnosed with dyslexia, you have to have an average or above average IQ. Because if you have a below average IQ, there's a good chance that it's something else. Like there's some other sort of processing disability or something. So that means that if you have dyslexia, it can be frustrating, and some people don't like to be tagged with that, so to speak. But it means that you're probably above average in intelligence, which is kind of neat. That's at least a nice thing for people to realize. And then I don't think this is anything new, because people have talked about this, but usually people with dyslexia have to kind of figure out how to make their situation work. And so they can actually be really good at other things, coping with their situation. I can't kind of speak too much beyond that, but I will say that it's worth considering a little bit. Maybe if you really do feel like your kid is having some difficulty learning. I don't know what dyslexia testing there would be in your area, but there are ways to get your kid tested. And then also, it's not like a medical test. It's going through. I don't even know what the test is, but there are ways to do it. A lot of schools do it. I don't know if they would do it for homeschoolers or not. There's also tutors, and I think they'd be cool. There may be stuff like this out there that helps resources that help parents know how to help their kids in a way that's actually been researched and studied well. So those are a few thoughts. Maybe just the last thing is sometimes people, and I think, once again, I don't want to get too far out of my depth here, but I feel like especially with boys, sometimes they just process differently to getting to that point of being able to read. And I knew this kid who was not reading very quickly. Then all of a sudden one day I saw him and he was reading out loud these pretty complex books for a 5-year-old. It took him a while, but when it clicked, it clicked. And so if I don't know the exact processing development, but like sometimes kids move at a different pace. You don't have to put your kid into a box, but if you're getting to that point where you are concerned, I know that my wife's work focuses significantly on like the elementary age, and that's when it's the best time to be working with kids. There's still strategies and things like that you can learn afterward, but always, the best time is to work with someone when they're younger.
All kinds of good, really great points there. Oh, that's awesome. All right. Well, I propose that why don't we take some of those as as subjects for additional deep dives, and maybe I feel like we've covered a lot of material. I feel like we're at a good stopping point. Josh, what can we do to help get whatever it is? It could be your podcast. It can be any project you're working on. It could be your dad's book. What do you want to tell the folks? And then, of course, I'll put anything in the show notes so you can help me with links.
Yeah. So, of most relevance to what we've talked about today, this isn't a resource, but just a reminder. Like, I think one of the best things you can be doing, well, two things: modeling what you say, actually living with integrity. And that should go without saying, but maybe it doesn't. So live with integrity and help your kids learn to love reading, primarily by reading to them, especially early on, but even as they continue to grow up. Of most relevance to what we've talked about today as far as resources go, yes, my dad's book, Discipleship in the Home by Matt Friedeman. A lot of people have found it to be helpful. You'll at least get an additional perspective from that book. If you want to hear more from me, I have a podcast that is fairly niche, I guess, like this one, and that's usually a really good thing. It's called Business Bitcoinization, and it's for business owners who are interested in or looking to or maybe have already adopted Bitcoin in their businesses. The idea is I want to help business owners hear from other business owners who are using Bitcoin and be encouraged to do the same. So if you want to find that, you can look it up on any podcasting platform. If you want to go to kind of the site where everything is, that's bizbit.blog.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Josh, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences with everybody. And we're very grateful for your time, and we're looking forward to many more conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast and if you found this valuable, please leave a review to help others find us too.
For those who prefer zapping sats, we love those too. We're on Fountain, we're on Noster, and we're on Orange Pill app.
Also, I host a women's only Bitcoin podcast called Orange Hatter. And the mission of that podcast is to reach pre-coiner women. So if you know of someone in your life that you would like to introduce Bitcoin to, check it out.
So Tali and I also don't have sponsors for this show. We are trying to build and run Free Market Kids. You can check out our products at freemarketkids.com. This includes the Bitcoin mining game HODL Up, which is a great introduction to Bitcoin.
The school edition of Huddle Up is always available. We also have the 2024 halving edition. It's going to be super deluxe. Very excited to roll it out. It is available on pre-sale at a 21% discount.
Until next time, happy hodling.